Mark was appointed chief of the Rare Book and Special Collections Division at the Library of Congress in 1998. As chief, he's responsible for the development and management of the Rare Book Collection, which is the largest collection of rare books in North America. Please help me welcome Mr. Mark Dimunation.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's really a great pleasure to come back to BIMA. And I'd like to start off by, as almost everyone involved in this conference has, by thanking Cynthia and Catherine for creating not only a really energizing conference, but pulling together a group of book artists who have really managed to create a sense of community while we're here. And there's been a lot of interaction amongst each other that I think is really rewarding and represents, I think, the intention behind the lovely display of artist books that are upstairs. I'm going to start with a story before we get into the actual text. Two stories, actually, because why tell one when you can tell two? But I'll begin with a moment about 25 years ago, maybe 24 years ago. I was visited by a young book artist who came in. He was carrying 3 books. They were pretty good. They were certainly accomplished in terms of typography. They were experimental. He was playing with sort of wash color, and they were good first starts. And I thought, well, this would be somebody to watch. He was really very deliberate about the way he presented them. And initially I thought, well, when he gets a little bit better, we'd be happy to buy something from him. But there was something about this kid that really, you just knew there was something about this kid. And the more I looked at him, the more I thought, he looks a little hungry. And I think he's really working up to and beyond his means. And he seems to really understand printing. So I did something rash, and I just said, you know what, I'll just take all 3 of these. He looked a little startled and left. 25 years later, I wrote the introduction to his catalog. I think it's because we just went this whole session an hour ago. Sorry. It was not to be about crying. I wrote an introduction to his catalog. In the catalog, he confessed that had he not sold books to the Library of Congress that day, he would have quit. Sorry, let me compose. Smartest acquisition I ever made. Okay, sorry about that. That wasn't meant to be that way at all. Cynthia, I shared the other day a text from a book artist who said, please say hello to my book, which is lurking somewhere in the shelves of Cynthia Sears' collection. And please thank her because she's the first person who ever bought a book for me. So, we all get together and we come and we talk about books. We talk about what they do, we talk about what they say, we talk about what they're made, how they're made. But what we really need to remind ourselves in this spirit is that we have to buy them. And we have to support them. So throughout this conversation, when we talk about supporting book artists, we need to support them. There, that's the only dramatic thing I have to say. I'm sorry for the tears. I'll have some water. The rest will just be dry academic conversation. Really sorry for that. I wouldn't want to diminish that story that way. Okay. The drone begins. When I was last at BIMA a few years ago, I had the opportunity to give a talk entitled A Baker's Dozen, 13 artist books that helped build a national collection. And I talked a bit about the criteria that I had learned from these 13 books in terms of how to build a collection, how to read books, not only my collection, but Cynthia's collection as well. Today I'd like to do something a little bit different. I'd like to look at books that act as agents of change. This is with apologies not only to Elizabeth Eisenstein, who wrote a book called The Printing Press as an Agent of Change, but as I learned earlier today, also to Jana Drucker, who talks about artist books as agents of change. It doesn't matter, I came up with the phrase. I hope you've seen Cynthia and Catherine's energizing exhibition, Boundless. It's provocative, and I think it raises some important questions and issues to be that we can be looking at. In the introduction to a portion of that exhibit, which is entitled Troubling, Artists' Books That Enlighten and Disrupt Old Ways of Being and Seeing, the organizers remind us that within the deep lineage of visual art that explores challenging subject matter, the genre of artist books has long played an integral role in educating about and advocating for themes of socio-political and cultural justice topics. Book artists utilize the book form in these cases to trouble or disrupt the status quo. As the modern book artists and the modern artist book springs into its own form, with its own aesthetic and its own language and its own motive, the more we're called upon as readers to bridge the distance between the intention of a work and its actually received meaning, and the more we're called upon to enter into that dialogue. I noted in the introduction to Boundless, the catalog, that collecting for Cynthia Sears was in fact a dialogue. It's a conversation between book artist and the person who's acquiring that book, and that the process of receiving an artist book is to read it, to understand it, and that from this we can have some hard-won lessons, whether that be a singular poetic moment, or an original artistic vision, or an idea that hadn't already been lodged in the mind of the reader. But whatever these are, gathering these books together tell us a great deal, not only about the book artist and these dialogues, but also the person who collects them. Today, I'd like to extend that dialogue even further and look at a number of books that bring into the conversation an explicit point of view. These books engage. These books confront. They mirror our assumptions and dare us to see differently. They expose injustice. They give voice to the unexpressed and understanding to the unexplained. With text and image, they posit a point of view, and through the powerful nature of the artist book, they create an experience that challenges us to acknowledge, if not to accept. And in that reading, change is fomented. So the books we're about to look at this afternoon run the gamut in terms of their message, from direct attacks on racism and homophobia to solemn remembrances of past protests from 9/11 and the COVID pandemic, from impassioned pleas for understanding and compassion to the singular gift of hope. Each has a lesson to be learned, each a message to be heard. In the most poignant and compelling way, Michael Kutsch recalls observing the fall of the World Trade Towers from his studio window. In Falling to Earth, printed by Double Elephant Press in 2002, Kutsch not only captures the emotional moment, but he raises the more difficult and vexing questions about human character and the meaning of a spiritual life. The book contains 14 printed letterpress poems and 21 etchings, mostly in color. The binding suggests the former World Trade Towers on a bright, clear morning. Kutsch's imagery uses the metaphor of falling to look at the human and spiritual cost of the violence. The mythological and biblical narratives are evoked in a modern framework that gives perspective to the terrifying events of that day. The poems and the etchings depict Icarus crashing in flames, Jacob's ladder with angels frantically scaling the heights, and even a parachuting Christ, as if somehow or another the heavenly host has been sent down to collect and transport souls, or Christ on a tightrope. And everywhere, the book is frequented by weeping angels, providing a vantage from above. And though the imagery does not shy away from a hard look at the toll of human violence during the event and the bombings that followed, the work is not concerned with a world of blame, but instead hopes to unfold as a topographical map of healing. Ilse Schreiber-Knoll has consistently turned her work to express her personal outrage through personal and visual art. Through her printmaking, paintings, and artist books, Schreiber-Knoll has explored issues that cut deeply, from social issues to the environment. We're looking here at her work, Save the Dream, Save the Planet, which is based on Langston Hughes' poem, Let America Be America Again. And from politics to war, She sees art as a path to personal liberation through social awareness. In her treatment of the events of 9/11, when the towers fell, Schreiber-Knoll uses woodcuts printed not on paper but on cheesecloth to create a sort of effect of both the destruction and crumbling of the towers, mirroring the accompanying text, which happens to be Galway Kinnell's intense prose poem. Some died while calling home to say they were okay. Some died after over an hour, after they learned they would die. Some died so abruptly they may have seen death from within it. Some broke windows. Some were asphyxiated, some burned, some fell, letting gravity speed them through to their long moment. Some leapt hand in hand. Perhaps the most compelling, or at least the most readily evocative, of these artist books exploring the event of 9/11 is Werner Pfeiffer's Out of the Sky, Remembering 9/11. This tribute to the victims of the terrorist attack is a three-dimensional book sculpture produced on the 5th anniversary in 2006. When assembled, it presents a model of the Twin Towers that's nearly 6 feet high, with images and names of the victims printed throughout. Pfeiffer explained that as he witnessed the second plane hit the tower, it wasn't a question of if, but when he would express his sense of anguish over the destruction. He goes on to say that he produced countless drawings to try and capture the fear that must have been endured by these people as they fell to their death. What finally emerged, he said, was a sketch of 2 very large woodcuts in the shape of the towers of the World Trade Center. Each tower has 7 segments, which are stacked over a supportive structure. The linear vision of the towers are obviously the names raining down. Each of the remnants of the piece rest in a container or an urn and are called up or resurrected as you build the tower. Any one of my staff will tell you that the actual construction of these towers as part of the performativity of the book becomes an act of meditation or commemoration. He feels that they all know. Jeffrey Morin and Sailor Boy Press take on a very different national tragedy, one that is equally all-encompassing and has left America changed forever, the HIV and AIDS crisis. After training with Walter Hamady, Jeffrey Morin began to pursue his academic career in the arts, producing a significant and unique body of work through Sailor Boy Press. His works often reveal a distinctive Sailor Boy style. Morin typically mixes paper stocks and colors throughout his work. His bold illustrations, many of them culled from dingbats and stray illustrations in type drawers, are surrounded by inclusions, as he calls them. Dingbats, postage stamps, clip art. Small objects like radio transmitters and other devices are sewn into the page. The product is uniquely a Sailor Boy production, although the influence of Walter Hamady is very present in all of this. In this work, Morin blends the 14 Stations of the Cross with the story of a contemporary Hispanic soldier named Jesus, who is closeted, married, and dying of AIDS. The text and the reduction lino cuts reference the traditional Stations of the Cross, but they also link the modern Jesus's life and struggles to the same moment in that life's journey. At the 3rd station, Jesus falls for the first time. The caption blends Christ's suffering at the hands of soldiers with Jesus' experience of harassment at the hands of the military. Jesus' experience. Jesus becomes burdened in spirit and body, sickness, exhaustion, the pace of life, and the pressures of his responsibilities begin to consume him. And then there is his wife to tell. Shown with the barbed wire crown of thorns and a rosary that accompanies the book. 14 Stations is one of the many books created as part of the Sailor Boy Press project that attempts to take themes from history and explore a modern application. The effort to combine social awareness with a sense of urgency and compassion drives many artists that strive to comment on major events in America. An extraordinary record of the experiences of the COVID pandemic, for example, was recently created by Gaylord Shanilak. People, he said, die twice, once when they die and once when no one remembers them. In the midst of his pandemic quarantine in rural Wisconsin, Gaylord Shanilak creates a spontaneous poem, a record of COVID-related events of March 2020 until the inauguration of Biden in 2021. Shanilak recalls, "I returned to rural Wisconsin where I found a matted crow feather in the wake of the receding snow. I made an engraving of the feather. I set a few lines of type and printed, but the result did not feel right. It felt rushed and unresolved. I was feeling jumpy, like a needle across a scratch. I decided to embrace that feeling. Tossed by the relentless jolts of the news cycle, what became a simple rumination on death evolved into a volume of illustrated concept journalism." He tracked the ongoing world death total, which is often interrupted in his discussion by the events that happen in this country. Images of the Crow family, the Corvid family, propel the poem forward, which addresses the killing of both George Floyd as well as the exposure of American racism. Open for business, timorously scrawled on plywood-covered storefronts, the list of the dead and portraits of Mr. Floyd drawn from a photograph screened on every device in the world. 8 minutes, 46 seconds. And what we know about George Washington's teeth. Political and constitutional language appears throughout, unfortunately, some very familiar phrases as well. I'm beautiful, I've done a great job, really beautiful, it's a witch hunt, it's unfair, they are bad people, they're very, very bad people. We'll move on. Emerging at the end with a quote from Amanda Gorman's inauguration poem. "Being American is more than a pride we inherit. It's the past we step into and how we repair it." The piece includes 3 wood engravings by Shanilak. The book consists of 7 loose 4-page bound pamphlets that are printed on Gampi paper. This is important because the effect is sort of fleeting and delicate and almost transparent. You move very carefully through this piece, cautiously and deliberately, making it a memorable meditation on a difficult year. Similar themes emerged when Emily Martin created work that was the mashup of her current book work, and emphasizing Shakespeare's plays, with her rambling, sporadic observations on the state of the world in the midst of the pandemic. Her recent work, Madness, Reading Hamlet in the Time of COVID-10 and Other Plagues by Emily Martin with Intrusions from the World Around Me and William Shakespeare. It's a chaotic, if you know Emily, you would expect this. It's a chaotic chronicle of those thoughts that interjected themselves into her work, from Hamlet to George Floyd. In the quiet isolation, I resolved to make accounting and outcounting a recounting of the experiences of the pandemic, resisting any inadvertent, reflexive, or protective discounting. Madness was created during the pandemic and went through many forms before it turned into what we see here. Its appearance and its contents are very much shaped by her time in isolation. Initially, Emily was copying out the play of Hamlet. She did this, she said, because she was too anxious to sit and read. She was also making paper puppets for companionship. If you follow Emily on Instagram, she would make a puppet a day and post them. The project kept changing as events swirled around her. She struggled to make a sense of the project in a world that she said had gone crazy. The text is a crazy quilt arrangement of lines from Hamlet and my writing on repeating themes of fear, disease, Black Lives Matter, Asian hate, crimes, the insurrection, so much death and isolation. The background pattern, as I think you might be able to make out, are renderings of teardrops, drops of blood, COVID-19 particles, and bullet holes. This is a section from one of her sheets. In the quiet of isolation, I was alone with my thoughts. National Public Radio brought me the world. In that quiet, I would listen to politicians explain how they were making us safer by suppressing access to voting, making women safer by cutting access to birth control and abortions, making schools safer by banning books but not guns. I would shatter the quiet, shouting at the radio. Those problems can weigh heavily. In a darker work, we're sometimes forced to consider what this author calls the unavoidable solution. In 2011, book artist and printmaker Lynn Avidanka took on the challenge to visualize the stark and often troubling short story of fractured fiction, as she calls it, by Bonnie Jo Campbell from her collection American Salvage. Although the story, The Solutions to Brian's Problem, never really explicitly states as much, this is a story about a husband and a father who must contend with his wife's addiction to crystal meth. We know only what we need to know in order to understand the dilemma at hand. Ben's wife, Connie, is a meth addict who is unable to moderate her increasingly dangerous behavior. She's also the mother of Ben's baby, and Ben fears losing the baby one way or the other because of neglect or outside interference. The story is presented as a series of 7 numbered possible solutions to Ben's problem. He might choose any one of them to solve the problem of Connie, each one more dire and dramatic than the one previous. The reader is thrown into the impossibility of Brian's situation and into the hopelessness, downward spiral of addiction. We are forced now to contemplate a solution to this problem. As much as we would prefer this not to be, it has now become our problem to solve. Or at least we're forced to understand the real struggle of coping with this tragic situation. Take, for example, contemplate solution number 3. Put the baby boy to bed in his crib and sit on the living room couch until Connie comes home. Before she has a chance to lie about where she's been, grab her hair and knock her head hard onto the fireplace that you built from the granite blocks that came from the old chimney of the house your great-grandfather built when your family first came to this country from Finland. Don't look at the wedding pictures on the mantle. Don't look at Connie's wide wedding day smile or the way her head tilts back in ecstasy that seems to have nothing to do with drugs. Put meth in her bag of syringes and blood-smeared needles into her hands so the cops find them when they arrive. You will tell them it's an accident. By translating this tale to a different material format, Avidanka has the license to provide her own reading. The text is presented as 12 cards or puzzle pieces. The stack of pages, in essence, is the hand that Brian is dealt. And the options are laid on the table. The reader tries to organize them, to place them into some kind of context. In Campbell's text, Ben ultimately chooses to do nothing, to simply continue to care for and thus enable Connie. Mix up some bottles of formula for later tonight. You'll be sitting in the living room. She's in the bathroom, searching for a vein to shoot into. When she finally comes out, brush her hair back from her face and try and get her something to eat. Avidanka literally treats the issue as it's something to be puzzled out. And when done so, she places an unexpected overlay of hope and positivity. When all the options are considered, only one is left. The dark alternative of his solutions are held at bay. Avidanka suggests that Ben needs to do more than simply turn away from the negative constructs that surround him. She tells us that he must embrace love. Sorry. You should be impressed that I did that. Yet embracing love sometimes is not enough. At least Belden Sezon's experience, as she has told us in To Separate the Body from the Machine, seems to indicate so. Belden Sezon is an artist and a writer who roots her practice in image perception and the collective experience of reading spaces. Her work is often sketch-like, stripped down to avoid flourish in order to reveal the truth of what she sees. She works from the form of graphic novels, artist books, drawings, essays, and installations. Her minimalist style, coupled with her activism, gives her work a real sensitivity, albeit perhaps a hard one. Her approach to materials mirrors this sensibility. She often uses newspapers and other repainted items that she paints in order to draw. My art often developed on a kitchen table. These are things I commonly use in my daily practice, things that we use commonly in society. If I use something that we all use, I, as an artist, can add to a journalistic approach in a different way. I can add stuff that other journalists can't say or won't say. In her moving and direct book, To Separate the Body from the Machine, which was done in 2015, she contemplates her work as a caretaker for a man who is living with a paralyzed body. Her intention with this work is to visualize my own confrontations and limits with such a paralyzed body, and its often hidden surprises with dealing with ways to move. The main focus, the space where we meet, is pain. Pain caused by the physical inability to move autonomously, as well as the counterpart, one's will to live. This will often render me speechless, she says, leaves me in awe. Cezanne chronicles the aching dilemma of caretakers who are compelled to give their all while knowing all along that it's not possible to do so. It just was a given, she says. He needed more than I could give. Even if I wanted to give it, I just couldn't. I couldn't do him any favors. I'm not out in the world to save anybody, and I've seen it happening in that realm of work. Like caretakers who say, oh, I'm here for you. I'll give you everything. It just doesn't work like that. It's not honest, and no one wants that. Cezanne used drawing and text to record this bold and compassionate scenario as she explains why she left the job. The work process includes sketching and then transferring the images to text, in this case on a recycled copy of the Brooklyn Rail. Over the past 3 decades, artist and author Clarissa Sly has made artist books and text-based installations that explore concepts and constructions of identity, transformation, and the family. Her approach to these themes varies, but they all seem to reveal her roots in North Carolina, which she describes as a blue-collar black community, small white frame houses, racially segregated public facilities, the gospel music of summer revivals, rhythm and blues, James Baldwin, and jazz. Framing the images of these recollections is much like choosing a perception on which to base one's reality. While participating in the Women's Studio Workshop in 2004, Sly created Wrongly Bodied 2, a work which relates in parallel the story of Jake, a contemporary white male as he transforms from female to male, and Ellen Craft, a 19th century black woman who escapes slavery by passing as a white man. In the process, Sly becomes conscious of a society's psychological response to the transgressive act of such a transformation. The concept of changing one's identity was not new to me, she says. Slaves had escaped to become free women and men. Recalling Ellen Craft's journey to freedom, Sly re-examines her own fears while challenging the difficult boundaries of gender, race, and class. When Sly was invited to photograph Jake's transition, she found herself conflicted. In addition to the world of transforming from one gender to another, that this is unknown to me, Deborah herself had many questions. As a woman, she had to dissolve, disintegrate, disappear, and reinvent herself as a man, despite feeling that she was already a man in a woman's body. What would that journey be like? What if she failed to complete her transition? Sly documented Jake's transformation over the course of 4 years. It was a profound journey for both of them. I can finally build the body that is in my head, Jake confessed. In response, Sly found herself confronting personal notions of self and body and identity. A person's decision to change gender, Sly recalled, is very difficult for many people to wrap their heads around. But my connection to this process came from an unexpected place for me. In my trying to understand Jake's motivation in a gender change, I used from my own social history racial passing. As Sly weighed Jake's experience from her own, she found herself drawn to the story of Ellen and William Craft, a couple held in slavery, and their efforts to escape to freedom. To be successful in their efforts, Ellen had to convincingly transform herself into a white man. Sly began to insert herself into both stories. For the first time, I understood that Ellen Craft was passing as white and as a man. While Jake would never think of himself as passing as a man, I gained a deeper understanding of what it meant for Ellen Craft to present herself as a man in antebellum America. Given the success of this edition, a later edition was produced as well, called Wrongly Bodied, Documenting Transitions from Female to Male. In 2006, just 2 years after that publication, and this is in the exhibition, if I'm not mistaken, yes? Yes, thank you. Calista Sly was invited by the Holter Museum of Art in Helena, Montana, to create an artwork for a group exhibition. So artists were invited to come and work with a box of white supremacist hate literature that someone in the Human Rights Network had managed to get their hands on from one of the defecting members of the group. Sly's response was her artist book chronicling the project that she's describing here, Transforming Hate. Quite rightly, as I mentioned, this appears in the Boundless exhibit upstairs. The concept of making artwork that transformed printed hate materials seemed a perfect fit with my exploration of one's place within the historical narrative of race, class, and gender, she said. Initially, she found this difficult even to look at the literature. Just seeing the books, she said, triggered her recollections of Jim Crow laws and growing up in segregation, and ideas of churches and hospitals and libraries and restaurants and movie theaters, all off limits to her and her race. That environment, she said, determined who I was and my place in society. But she said that the box of books made her realize that the conditioning of hate is very much alive and that the recruitment of others to hate those who are seen as different continues to this day. Thinking transformation once again and looking for a way to handle the books, I remember the thousands of origami cranes I saw while visiting the Hiroshima Peace Memorial in 1985. Sly transformed the book into 1,000 paper cranes and says, I hope the viewer will revisit his or her own perceptions about history, reality, identity, and voice. Why do we keep each other from being who we really are? Can we begin to talk about what separates us? Do we have the courage to live differently? These questions remind me of Robin's work that we were looking at yesterday, these large questions that just sit there while we contemplate them. I have done all these things before. Brian D. Tripp's artist book, Goodbye Columbus, 2019, opens with the line, oh yeah, we still remember that day you showed up and began hauling all of our stuff away. Tripp was an outspoken poet, writer, and artist who used his artwork to foster the flourishing of his Northern California Karuk tribal community and the Native American culture. Tripp's artist books and drawings reference the historic ledger drawings made by Native Americans who had been displaced from their tribal lands and moved to the camps in the Southeast. Lacking ordinary supplies, they began to do their drawing in ledger books and journals that were lying around. And their symbolism and stories are recollected in these ledger books. Tripp utilizes his traditional image. Did we move ahead or not? Did we stay still? Thank you. Tripp utilizes this traditional image vocabulary of basket motifs, arrowheads, ceremonial objects, and tribal garb, and reworks them into a modern visual language informed by color and geometry. In this fashion, Tripp can pay homage to the inherent power of images that have long been in use. Tripp's work reflects his lifelong activism.
One slide behind.
What's this?
Are you one slide behind?
Nope.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you. Tripp's work reflects his lifelong activism while addressing a variety of themes, including colonization, urban development, and cultural revival. Through my body flows the blood of singers and dancers, makers of dance regalia, carvers and basket makers, gatherers, hunters, and fishermen, all believers in the traditional religion and the old ways. I know I am these people, and I have done all these things before. Early on in Tripp's graphic paintings were executed in a language of hard-edged geometry that drew upon the traditional language of abstract form that had been used for millennia by the Karuk basket weavers, adapting ancient designs with names like cut wood, long worm, snake nose, and snailback to a modern medium and purpose. Unlike most Western forms of abstract art, Tripp's forms are never divorced from the land. His geometry is always founded in geography. Both his work and his life are tied to the Karuk people's traditional task of world renewal. The Karuk are set apart from their ancestral ties to places of ritual significance, places where divine forces move. Self-described as the people from the center of the world, they are also the people whose traditional responsibility has been to fix it. In a very different matter, Peter Koch, in a series of books, has managed to capture the images of 19th century Western America and put them to ready and meaningful use by simply relabeling our understanding of them, whether it's still life or hard times. He shows the devastation not only of wildlife, but the landscape as well. In Their Memory is a book of resistance that carries forward the protests begun by the families of the disappeared in Chile during the military dictatorship between 1973 and 1990. More than 40,000 political prisoners were victims of torture, execution, and exile, and 3,550 people were simply disappeared. Nameless crosses are all that have been received by way of burial. It is to this honor of the missing and their families that this object book seeks to disseminate and communicate human rights violations in Chile. By documenting the identities of these victims, In Their Memory also invites reflection and puts forth a message of hope and founded in truth. Maria Veronica San Martin is a Chilean living in New York. She's a graduate of the Corcoran program in DC. She works primarily with artist books, but her work more frequently is turned into installation and performance pieces, all rotating around issues of human justice. Over the past 5 decades, Ken Campbell has created a body of work of letterpress printing and artist books that is unchained, free of affiliation, and beholden to nothing other than the strike force of the creative vision of his poetry and the printer itself. Each book is undeniably clear that Campbell's art bursts out of the press, concocted when poetry and vision and politics collide on the page. In their collaborative artist book, 10 Years of Uzbekistan, Campbell and Irish photographer David King confront the ruthless brutality of the corrupt Soviet regime under Joseph Stalin. Their book was inspired by the 1934 government-commissioned commemorative album of the same name, designed by the Russian avant-garde artists Alexander Rodchenko and Varvara Stepanova. Rodchenko's copy of the book served as the model for Campbell and King. Designed to observe 10 years of Soviet rule in the Republic of Uzbekistan, Rodchenko's publication featured an array of photographs of the region's functionary, along with sort of dreamy, unrealistic stories of their success in the regime, especially in agricultural output. By the time the book was issued, many of the pictured party and government officials had fallen out and were purged and executed. To avoid any suspicions about his own loyalty, Rodchenko felt compelled to engage in self-censorship, blotting out with black ink the names and faces of the murdered men and women in his copy of the book. In recreating and supplementing aspects of Rodchenko's book, Campbell and King give us a glimpse of the power and evil of tyranny and its devastating consequences. 10 Years of Uzbekistan takes the aggressive physical gesture to the level of metaphor. Its pages have been pounded through the press, and layers and layers and layers of overprinting obliterate and censors the face of these now missing victims. Each portrait is framed by a pewter frame that had this persistent and vexing habit of popping while he was printing. And so if you knew Ken Campbell, you know what the solution is. Outrage and a staple gun. And he staples this thing so flat with so many staples that they begin to print on the press and create an entire texture around this. one's emotional reaction, not only to the violence of the images, but just the violence of the printing itself, is a particularly profound reading of this text. To be aware of Rodchenko's album sets the historical contents, but the real power of Ken Campbell's treatment is its intense journey into pathos. 5-Year Plan is a cooperatively made artist book. Aren't you glad we're moving into something pleasant? Produced as part of Artist Action in the spirit of Mahatma Gandhi ashram, working ashrams. This was developed in order to benefit Doctors Without Borders. It was organized by Aaron Sinif, who is a book artist, who organized a work commune in India around the ashram collective. The intention was to have a community grow and cultivate the materials that would eventually be used to make the 5-Year Plan book. Cotton handmade khadi cloth was at the center of Gandhi's program, and it's also at the center of the creation of this book, which is printed on that cloth. And also it is a cloth that's used to create the bag, the canvas bag that it's sold in. The final product was a handmade cloth book featuring the artwork of 32 contemporary artists, including the likes of Yoko Ono, Francesco Clemente, and others. The 5-Year Plan project employed scores of people, from farmers and weavers to printers and artists. Spinning and weaving the khadi for a 5-year plan created more than 2,400 days of work for the ashram and kept 100 families employed for a month. And it left the community with a collective activity that could help sustain the ashram in the future. We were discussing Marshall Weber and Fred Ryan just before I came in to sit down. Marshall Weber, who was involved with Brooklyn, is a man of intense and impassioned politics. He doesn't waste any time. As you can tell from one of his books that he did with Fred, Bedtime for Bremer Reloaded, 2007, we have an idea of what Condoleezza Rice is going to be up to in this book, and it's not good news for Mr. Bremer. But to spare you all that, I will instead show you the remapping of the country formerly known as Iraq. Subdivided between Coke and Pepsi, and then the various warring factions taking over the states and shape of Iraq. This is one of many books. Marshall has a book in the exhibition about the names of Holocaust survivors. It's in your face, the politics are undeniable, and they become important and impassioned reads when you actually spend time with them. John Rousseau's work has always had a political or social commentary to it. Working mostly in single sheets and broadsides, Rousseau cuts through the verbiage to make his point, a little bit more delicately perhaps than Marshall, but he doesn't waste any time as well. Boom is certainly an example of this. The subject is landmines and landmine victims. From 2001 to 2007, the Paper Landmine Print Project involved making paper and printing landmine images, facts, and stories of victims on it. The paper was made out of rags as well as plant fibers, including articles of clothing owned by landmine victims, not actually in the victimization itself. Fibrous plants from mine locations and shredded paper currencies of nations who use or make landmines. Rousseau visited Cambodia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and Mozambique to gather background information, interview victims, obtain donations of clothing, for some speak with deminers, as they're called, and take photographs. Through other contacts, he had connections with northern Iraq, Nicaragua, and Angola. Proceeds from the sale of this work have been and will continue to be donated to various landmine survivor organizations. In Report US, Ellen Boxer set out to document in a material fashion the unbridled epidemic of gun violence in America. Struck by the daily onslaught of news about events that involved a gun and the haunting poetry of factual accounts, I embarked on a monumental project to compile and edit individual reports and assemble them into a tangible and visually evocative account of this shameful history. She's produced 2 versions of this book. The first is a box set of 31 plain white volumes, which you see here, each representing one day in the month of January 2015. Each page reports a single incident of gun violence. Pay attention to the size of January 1st. I'll mention that in a moment. The text is represented without editorial or poetics, just straightforward reportage. The dynamics of the statistical record become apparent through the physical nature of the publication. For example, volume for January 1st, often the most violent day in the year, is significantly larger than the other volumes. There were 3,136 incidents of gun violence in the month of January 2015. The second and larger version of Report US represents each week with a massive volume. The bindings of the 52 volumes are wrapped with cloth dyed in cow's blood. The end papers are very bright red with an unfixed pigment that will leave traces on the reader's fingertips when touched. The text paper would eventually become marred with red fingerprints, more and more each time the volumes are read, mirroring the theme of bleeding and the exponential nature of this violence. Both versions of the work require that the reader hold and reveal the individual moments of violence. We are more than just viewers, for the nature of the problem is in our hands, and as she reminds us, blood is on our hands. So let's close with an artist whose works we have on display in the Boundless exhibition that might be a little lighter than some of the material I've thrown at you. In so many ways, the bookworks of Laura Davidson are the exception to the notion of a defiant, emphatic book artist. A Boston-based book artist, Davidson employs drawing, printmaking, watercolor work, found objects, metalwork, and a variety of formats to create her books. Over the years, she has created unique books, hand-printed editions, and offset printed editions. Most of her books require an extraordinary amount of unique handwork and craft construction. Davidson's work often captures the quiet, minute moments of daily life and celebrates them. Nostalgic, mindful, her works are often drawn from the lives of women at work, and other times of women in protest. The accordion-based fanfold book pays tribute to the silent sentinels who stood vigil at the White House for 2.5 years to gain the right for women to vote. They held their ground from January 1917 until June 1919, when the House and the Senate passed the 19th Amendment. By November of 1920, 8.4 million women exercised their right to vote. Certainly one of the most evocative pieces is Random Thoughts on Hope from 2003, a meditation created when Laura thought she was struggling with a deadly cancer. This unique flux poetry book is housed in a mahogany book box that holds a tiered tower of what we call vivelles, or spinning wheels, that are decorated with words. Each spin of the wheels randomly creates new lines of flux poetry about hope. Hope begins inside thought. Hope changes around chance. We are reminded here of the visual power of word and object combined, that both are formed from abstractions and that both are codes to be deciphered. This is the notion of what Lynn Avidanka calls the philosophical and physical presence of the book. Random Thought on Hope is a repository of memory and loss. It is a vehicle for expressing transcendental emotion, and it is a keeper of narratives. All that Laura Davidson asks is that we read it and seek to understand. And in so doing, the act of reading will change us. Thank you. Thank you.
I'm sure that there's questions from the audience.
Oh, do you want to do questions? Sure. Let me apologize for the stuff at the beginning. For the emotional stuff at the beginning that caught me off guard.
You know, let me just say something about that. That this whole weekend has been very emotional. And it's worthy of being emotional. This subject matter makes everyone cry, makes everyone get mad, makes everyone want to have hope. And that's what this weekend's all about, and it's perfectly wonderful that you did that.
Thank you.
I agree. In fact, I thought it made the moment more moving rather than less. So please don't feel like you diminished it.
Thank you.
I did want to ask about the book about the people that disappeared in Chile. I don't remember the name. You did have a lot. Were those pieces meant to be stacked?
It's a flag book, so as you open you open the fold, it either weighs one way or the other. There's a face on one side, a name on the other, and it's a kind of fold of a book usually called a flag book. So it condenses into a tall, narrow fan fold, but as you open it, there are separate cuts that flutter out. So you are surrounded with faces of people popping up, and as you turn it, their names pop up, and it's a very much an immediate reminder that these people are missing.
Thank you.
She's very talented.
I can tell.
Veronica is.
First, I just want to thank you for this tour de force of a presentation. But moving to a bit more practical or day-to-day outlook, could you talk a little bit about the use of the Book Arts Collection at Library of Congress and what your policies for acquisition are?
Sure. The Book Arts Collections at the LC, which is probably one of the largest book arts collections in the country, has several layers. We are a research library, and you can come and look at anything we have in our collection in the reading room. Just simply ask for it. If we need to show you how to handle it, we'll do that. We're very careful with our books, but everything is accessible to you. We do a large amount of classroom presentation several times back in the days. Now not so much, but back in the day we would have several times a week classes from various institutions and what we're now calling the DMV, the District, Maryland, and Virginia, who come and look at any aspect of artist book, from printmakers to typographical artist books to books that move and squeak and whatever it is, and we were able to pull those materials for them. We also do something that's called Thursdays at 3, which tries to be fairly consistent, not every week, but Thursdays at 3 is when book artists are invited to come. They give a talk about their book, and because we have materials, we have them out on the table for people to look at afterwards. They're very popular. Usually about 100 and 150 people come. You learn a lot about the book and the book artist, and they're thrilled to be able to explain their material. We often get further materials because of that. So we do that as well. I also do open houses. These have changed now since pandemic, but the Library of Congress has an exhibition policy, which is we are one library. So we don't do a rare book division exhibit. We do an exhibit on immigration or on suffrage, but we don't do Mark's books. So for artist books to get in the exhibition, they have to be about whatever topic is going on, which we've done. I mean, Laura Davidson's book showed up for a while in the suffrage exhibit, for example. So to counter that, we do open houses in the division. We pull out all the chairs, both in the reading room and the Rosenwald room. We put out about 150 books on a table. We keep the room open for 5 hours. We usually have about 500 to 600 people come through, the power of an email list. And that's close up and personal. It's as close an experience as the really lovely display upstairs, which is open and unencumbered. Don't touch the books, but gives you that sense of directness. It's the only time we get to do that at LC. And it does make a difference. So all of those are things that we do to try and promote it. Now that we are blogging, we'll be doing probably monthly or maybe twice a month new artist books as they're acquired. The acquisition policy is we try to buy American because we're documenting the book arts in America. We have a fine press as well as an artist book collection. We don't make a distinction between them in our vocabulary. Some of these were fine press books today, for example. They're all part of the book arts, and that's usually how we approach this as a book arts collection. We buy across a large range. I try, although 1, 2, maybe 3 books in this presentation were unique. I try not to buy unique books because they document something different than a larger expression of book arts. And if you tend to buy them individually, it can be very expensive. Cynthia has a wonderful collection that's largely cultivated around unique books, and she does a really magnificent job of promoting not only book arts, but also that sense of unique book. But I bet if you ask her, she'll tell you they're expensive. Right? That doesn't mean we shouldn't buy them, but I have to do a number of things. I also have to buy books I don't like because I'm really trying to document moments and there's certain people whose work I don't really care for but are popular or influential, and I have to do that. So we try and build across a range of experiences. We just recently did a full survey of the collection for African American book artists. This is a frustrating thing about book arts. We catalog them much like you catalog literature. Therefore, I can't even tell you whether it's a male or a female who's made the book. We don't tag books as female book artist, male book artist. It's just the name of the author and the book. So if they're not self-identified in some way, I can't tell you the race, or in some cases the gender of the book artist. And yet we feel very strongly that we want to make sure that we have a representative gathering of materials in our holdings. I have a comprehensive of the women's workshop collection, so I'm not worried about representing women in the book arts. I have 155 authors who came in the last 3 years. So, but I am concerned about being able to identify and then talk intelligently about the nature of African American book arts, if there is in fact something to say about that. And so we had to go through a process of contacting people and making connections and finding out where these books are. They don't normally show up through, I went to such and such a school and now I'm being carried by such and such a dealer. They have a very different route to the market. And we've compiled a list now about 60 people who we're beginning to acquire to fill that in. So we do things that are rather deliberate that way. I could go on. There are other things we try to do. We try to make sure that we represent all aspects of print technology, that we don't just do woodcuts or engravings, that kind of thing. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Yeah.
What is your background? Do you have an art background?
I came into the rare book world through history. I'm an historian. And like many historians, I thought I was clever when I was at Berkeley to get a job in the rare book room, because then I could do my research while I was working, and the next thing I knew, I was the assistant head of acquisitions of rare books, and we were off to go. So that's how these things happen.
Well, you speak eloquently of art, and so I wondered if you had a background.
Oh, thank you. No, seat of the pants.
Yeah.
Many years, and mostly talking to book artists and getting an understanding. Plus, I have a lot of history of printmaking in my background. I'm a rare book librarian, so I can talk for hours about 15th century woodcuts and 16th century engraving. So some of it's just straightforward, but it's mostly I learned from book artists and people who are researching them. Yep.
So as a collector, as a buyer, curator for the collection, the Library of Congress, I'm curious how, knowing Sandra, knowing Cynthia, these curator collectors, you have all these stories, all this information in your head. What do you imagine happening for the person who replaces you?
Yeah. Well.
And these stories and books, is there anything we can learn from to translate, transfer some of this knowledge?
I'm sure Kitty can talk to some of this, having just left a position that she was very much identified with, and certainly ground shaking in terms of her influence. I've been at the Library of Congress for 25 years. This collection has me stamped all over it. I will agree to that. I also think I'm kind of a smart puppy about it, so it's not so bad if that's the case. But there are reasons for why certain people are collected comprehensively, why certain archives are bought and others aren't. And I do need to convey that. One, because it's not just personal aesthetics, the next person may not quite just have the vocabulary, and we'll start to wonder why we did this sort of thing. So we've been doing kind of, my staff call it story hour with Mark, but and there is some truth to that. If you've sat with me for 5 minutes, you know that. But I try and impart what my thinking is. I talk through books. I tell them as many personal stories as I can, usually without crying. So we have, for example, Russell Merritt's archive. See, now I'm calm, I can say his name. And that came from that experience, but he was very much affiliated with us all the way through and watched his career grow. So the collection belongs to us because we are the best place for him. And we owe him a great deal of energy to make that archive useful. Archives, for those of you who are wondering, are filled with not just correspondence, but all the drawings, paper samples, dummies, pulls, wrong turns, books that never got finished, all that, so that people can actually see the process by which a book is made. I also buy making copies, which some people don't do, or ask people to give me a making copy, which is if a book is being produced, I ask if I can get a special copy that includes all the drawings and pulls for a particular image, plus the matrix or the woodcut or whatever, and maybe something else special, so that when a student from one of our classes comes to work with it, they're not just looking at the finished product, but they get to see the sketches and how they got translated into color block and how the color sequencing was established. All the stuff that Kitty, for example, has to figure out when she was doing her book, what color went first. We try to answer that question now so that 50 years from now people aren't trying to figure that out, but it also gives you a sense of how the book was made. So I think some of it is just my telling stories, talking about it. I do write about it a lot in-house. I mean, there are labels for these books that I do. There are people who I think share that sensibility pretty directly, and you hope for the best. But frankly, you know, I did the best I could do, and then I have to leave, you know, so the next person will have to do the best they could do. And you hope that it honors the work that's there, but that, you know, they might be far more clever than I and come in and really make hay out of that collection in a way that I couldn't. So you just never know. But it's too much commitment. The collection has grown too big. They can't just ignore this collection now. So we're there.
Right.
Yeah.